Story 1. The Shadows in the Woods. It was New Year's Eve, 2017, and the world seemed determined to test Ethan Caldwell's resolve. A 22-year-old student at the University of Rochester, Ethan had just endured a grueling semester, compounded by personal troubles that forced him to linger on campus long after his peers had departed for the holidays. Christmas had been a lonely affair, spent in the echoing silence of his dorm room, with only the hum of the radiator for company. Now, as he boarded a delayed flight from Rochester to his hometown just outside Cleveland, Ohio, his mood was already sour. The final nail in the coffin came at the airport, where he watched his beloved Cleveland Browns lose their last game of the season, cementing a humiliating 0-16 record, the first winless season for an NFL team since the 1980s. For a lifelong fan like Ethan, it was a gut punch. The flight itself was uneventful, but the delay meant Ethan's carefully laid plans for the evening were unraveling. His family had intended to drive together to his cousin's house in rural Ohio for a New Year's Eve celebration. But with his plane landing hours late, his parents made the call to leave early, taking the family's main car. Ethan was left to make the 2-hour journey alone in the spare vehicle, a beat-up sedan that creaked with every turn. His mother, in a gesture of comfort, left Vera, their golden retriever, to keep him company. Vera, with her boundless energy and unwavering loyalty, was the one bright spot in an otherwise dismal day. Ethan tossed his luggage into the trunk, secured Vera in the passenger seat, and hit the road, determined to salvage what was left of the night. The drive began under a starless sky, the Ohio back roads stretching out like dark ribbons through endless fields and dense patches of forest. A light dusting of snow coated the ground, just enough to catch the glow of Ethan's headlights, but not enough to pose a threat. The world beyond the car's windows was cloaked in an oppressive darkness, broken only by the occasional flicker of a farmhouse porch light in the distance. Ethan tried to focus on the road, but his mind churned with frustration over the Browns, the delay, the solitude of the holidays. Vera, sensing his mood, rested her head on his arm, her warmth a quiet reassurance. About an hour into the drive, Vera began to stir. At first, it was just a soft whine, barely audible over the hum of the engine. Ethan reached over to scratch her ears, assuming she was restless. But then she stood, her body tense, pacing in the cramped passenger seat. Her whines grew urgent, and Ethan realized she needed a bathroom break. He groaned, scanning the road for a place to pull over. The next clearing was little more than a narrow shoulder bordered by a thick wall of trees, but it would have to do. He eased the car to a stop, the tires crunching on the frosted gravel, and stepped out into the biting cold. The darkness was absolute, the kind that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. If not for the faint patches of snow reflecting his headlights, Ethan might have felt like he was standing at the edge of the void. He let Vera out, not bothering with her leash. She was a good dog, never straying far, and the desolate surroundings offered little to tempt her. She sniffed along the tree line, her golden fur glowing faintly in the car's beams. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets, his breath clouding in the frigid air, and tried to ignore the creeping unease that settled over him. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the rustle of Vera's movements and the distant howl of the wind. Then, without warning, a sound shattered the stillness. A loud, deliberate crash, like a heavy body forcing its way through the underbrush. It wasn't the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. It was something big, something purposeful, moving through the woods with reckless abandon. Ethan's heart lurched, his body jolting as if struck. He scanned the darkness, squinting to pierce the veil of shadows beyond the first row of trees, but the night was impenetrable. "Vera!" he called, his voice sharp with urgency. But before he could react, Vera bolted, her form vanishing into the woods with a speed that left Ethan frozen in shock. Panic surged through him, raw and electric. He shouted her name, his voice echoing unanswered in the vast emptiness. Vera was gone, swallowed by the forest, chasing whatever had made that sound. Ethan's mind raced with possibilities: coyotes, a bear, or something worse. He couldn't leave her out there, not his family's dog, not the one companion who had seen him through this miserable day. Without a second thought, he plunged into the woods, his phone's dim flashlight casting a feeble glow against the gnarled trees. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows, the snow-dusted ground uneven beneath his boots. Branches clawed at his jacket, and the cold seared his lungs with every ragged breath. He called for Vera, his voice growing hoarse, but the only response was the crunch of his own footsteps and the pounding of his heart. The deeper he went, the more disoriented he became, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. He stumbled over roots, his flashlight flickering as the battery strained. Fear began to tighten its grip, not just for Vera, but for himself. What was out here? What had made that sound? After what felt like an eternity, his lungs burning and his legs trembling, Ethan collapsed against a tree, his body racked with exhaustion. Despair threatened to overwhelm him, the weight of the night pressing down like a physical force. He was lost, alone, and Vera was gone. Just as he felt himself slipping into hopelessness, a faint movement caught his eye. There in the dim glow of his flashlight was Vera, crouched low, her body trembling, her tail tucked tightly between her legs. She moved toward him slowly, her eyes wide with a fear Ethan had never seen in her before. Relief flooded through him, so intense it brought him to his knees. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling the rapid thud of her heart against his chest. "Oh, thank God," he whispered, burying his face in her fur. But the moment of reprieve was short-lived. Vera's trembling wasn't just from the cold. Something had terrified her, something that was still out there. Ethan's senses snapped back to high alert, the hairs on his neck prickling as he realized they were far from safe. He stood pulling Vera close and began to retrace his steps, though he had no clear sense of direction. The woods seemed to shift around him, the shadows twisting into menacing shapes. Then from behind, another crash. This one closer, more deliberate. It was following them. Ethan's blood turned to ice, his instincts screaming at him to run. He grabbed Vera's collar, and they took off, stumbling through the underbrush as the crashing grew louder, relentless, like a predator closing in. By some miracle, Vera seemed to know the way, her instincts guiding them through the maze of trees. Ethan followed, his legs burning, his breath coming in desperate gasps. The crashing was right behind them now, a cacophony of snapping branches and heavy footfalls. He didn't dare look back, his mind consumed by the singular goal of reaching the car. Finally, the tree line broke, and the faint glow of his headlights pierced the darkness. The car was there, a beacon of safety in the chaos. Ethan threw open the passenger door, practically shoving Vera inside before diving into the driver's seat. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. What he saw froze his blood. At the edge of the woods, illuminated by the red glow of his taillights, stood three figures, tall, motionless, their faces obscured by the darkness. They were watching him, their presence a silent threat that sent a shiver down his spine. He slammed the car into gear and floored the gas, the tires spinning on the icy gravel before catching traction. The car lurched forward and Ethan didn't stop, didn't even slow down until the woods were miles behind him. His heart was still racing, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. It wasn't until he glanced at Vera, curled up in the passenger seat, that he noticed the blood. A shallow cut ran along her shoulder blade, the fur matted with crimson. Someone or something had struck her. Ethan pulled over, his hands trembling as he rummaged through the trunk for the first aid kit his mother always insisted on keeping. He cleaned and bandaged the wound as best he could, wincing at Vera's soft whimpers. The act of tending to her grounded him, pulling him back from the edge of panic. By the time he was done, the adrenaline had begun to fade, leaving a hollow exhaustion in its wake. He drove the rest of the way in silence, his mind replaying the events in a loop. Who were those figures? Why had they attacked Vera? The questions gnawed at him, but he had no answers. When he finally arrived at his cousin's house, the party was in full swing, the warmth and laughter a stark contrast to the terror of the woods. He didn't tell anyone what had happened, not his parents, not his cousins. It felt too raw, too surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't quite shake. Vera recovered, her wound healing without complications, but she was never quite the same. She grew skittish at night, her once boundless courage tempered by whatever she had encountered in those woods. Years later, Ethan still avoids that stretch of road. The memory of those figures lingers, a shadow that haunts his quiet moments. He doesn't know what they were, hunters, vagrants, or something darker. But he knows one thing for certain: he and Vera were lucky to escape with their lives. Story 2. The Snowplow Stranger. For Sarah Mitchell, New Year's Eve was supposed to be a time of renewal, a chance to reconnect with her family after a year of relentless work. A 29-year-old graphic designer based in Philadelphia, Sarah had always cherished the annual pilgrimage to her parents' home in upstate Pennsylvania, a quaint farmhouse nestled in the rolling hills. The 3-hour drive was a ritual she relished, a chance to lose herself in the rhythm of the road and the quiet beauty of the countryside. But on December 31st, a few years ago, that ritual turned into a nightmare she would never forget. The day started innocently enough. Sarah packed her sedan with a duffel bag, a bottle of her mother's favorite wine, and a playlist of classic rock to keep her company. The weather forecast had mentioned a chance of snow, but Sarah, ever the optimist, dismissed it as a minor inconvenience. She left in the late afternoon, the sky a soft gray, the air crisp but not yet biting. For the first hour, the drive was everything she loved: empty highways, rolling fields, and the occasional deer grazing in the distance. She sang along to Springsteen, her spirits high despite the long year behind her. Then the snow began to fall. At first it was gentle, a scattering of flurries that danced in her headlights. Sarah found it beautiful, the way the snowflakes caught the light, transforming the world into a winter postcard. But her optimism was short-lived. The flurries thickened, the wind picking up until the snow was coming down in sheets, blanketing the road and reducing visibility to a few feet. The highway grew slick, her tires struggling to grip the icy surface. Sarah's sedan, reliable in the city but woefully unprepared for a blizzard, began to fishtail on even the slightest inclines. Her heart sank as she realized she couldn't keep going. The storm was too fierce, the conditions too treacherous. With a heavy sigh, she pulled onto the shoulder, far enough from the road to avoid any passing vehicles, though there were none to be seen. She texted her parents, trying to sound calm despite the growing knot in her stomach. Her mother responded with a flurry of worried messages, her father offering to drive out to her. Sarah shot down the idea immediately. The thought of her father braving the storm was unthinkable. She assured them she'd wait it out, maybe call the police if things didn't improve. But as she sat in the car, the engine idling to keep her warm, doubt crept in. The snow showed no signs of letting up, piling up around her tires and obscuring the road ahead. An hour passed, then 2. The isolation began to weigh on her, the howling wind a constant reminder of her vulnerability. She rationed the car's heat, turning it on and off to conserve gas, but the cold seeped in, chilling her to the bone. Her phone battery was dwindling, and the thought of spending the night stranded filled her with dread. Just as despair began to take hold, a pair of headlights pierced the storm, growing brighter in her rearview mirror. Relief washed over her, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. A snowplow, its blade scraping the road, pulled up beside her, a beacon of hope in the chaos. Sarah rolled down her window, the cold air hitting her like a slap. The driver, an older man in his late 50s, leaned out of his cab. He was bundled in a heavy jacket, a black knit hat pulled low over his ears. His face was weathered, etched with deep lines that spoke of a life spent battling the elements. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, studied her for a moment longer than felt comfortable. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough, like gravel scraped across stone. There was a smoker's rasp to it, a quality that set Sarah's nerves on edge. She forced a smile, explaining that her car couldn't handle the storm. He nodded, his expression unreadable, and said she wouldn't get far in conditions like these. There was a pause, a moment where his gaze seemed to linger on her back seat, as if searching for something. Then he offered her a ride. Sarah hesitated. The man seemed genuine, his offer a lifeline in the midst of the blizzard. But there was something about him, his gruff demeanor, the way his eyes darted, that made her uneasy. Still, the alternative was staying in her car, risking hypothermia or worse. She asked if he could take her to her parents' house, and he nodded, saying it was no trouble. When she asked about her car, he shrugged. "Leave it." Reluctantly, Sarah grabbed her bag and climbed into the snowplow's cab. The warmth was immediate, a stark contrast to the bone-chilling cold of her sedan. She sank into the seat, her muscles relaxing for the first time in hours. The man asked where she was headed, and she gave him the directions, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her. He nodded again, but said little else, the silence settling over them like a heavy fog. At first it wasn't uncomfortable, but as the minutes ticked by, Sarah's unease grew. She glanced at her phone, checking the GPS, and her stomach dropped. They were going the wrong way. The highway stretched out before them, but the navigation showed they were heading in the opposite direction of her parents' house. She tried to stay calm, her voice light as she asked if they were going the right way. The man's demeanor shifted, a subtle tightening of his jaw. Without looking at her, he said they were taking a detour, that the back roads would be clearer than the highway. His tone was flat, almost rehearsed, and it sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She didn't know the area well enough to argue, but her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. As they turned off the highway onto a narrow, snow-covered road, Sarah's unease turned to fear. She glanced around the cab, her eyes catching on details she'd missed in her relief. Empty liquor bottles rolled at the man's feet, their labels faded and peeling. Torn maps were stuffed into the door pockets, their edges frayed. And then she saw it, a hunting knife, its blade glinting faintly, wedged between the seats. Her heart began to pound, the sound deafening in her ears. She clutched her phone, the GPS now recalibrating wildly as the man ignored turn after turn, his focus fixed on the road ahead. The road grew narrower, the trees closing in, their branches heavy with snow. Sarah's mind raced, her fear mounting with every passing mile. She spotted a house in the distance, its windows glowing faintly through the storm, the only sign of civilization she'd seen in miles. It was her chance, maybe her only one. She waited until they were close, her hands trembling as she gripped the door handle. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, she kicked the door open and leaped out, the cold air hitting her like a physical blow. She hit the ground hard, pain shooting through her leg, but she didn't stop. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her boots sinking into the snow as she sprinted toward the house. Behind her, the man shouted, his voice laced with anger. She glanced back, catching a glimpse of him reaching into the glove box, possibly for a weapon. Fear propelled her forward, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she reached the house. She pounded on the door, her fists aching, her voice hoarse as she screamed for help. The door swung open, and a middle-aged couple pulled her inside, their faces etched with concern. Sarah collapsed onto the floor, her body shaking as she gasped out her story. The couple didn't hesitate. They called the police, their voices calm but urgent. By the time the officers arrived, the snowplow was gone, its tracks already buried by the relentless storm. The police searched the area, but the blizzard made it impossible to find the man. They took Sarah's statement, their expressions grim, and offered to drive her to her parents' house. They even arranged for her car to be towed, a small act of kindness that felt like a lifeline. Sarah's father was furious when he learned what had happened, his anger masking his fear. Sarah, still shaken, vowed never to drive in a snowstorm again. The memory of that night lingers, a shadow that resurfaces every winter. Sarah still wonders who the man was, a drifter, a predator, or something worse. She thinks about the knife, the liquor bottles, the way his eyes scanned her back seat. Most of all, she thinks about what might have happened if she hadn't jumped from that snowplow, if she hadn't trusted her instincts. The thought is enough to keep her awake at night, long after the snow has melted. Story 3, The Trap on the Frozen Lake. For Jacob Harper, New Year's Eve was never about crowded bars or glittering parties. Growing up in the rugged wilderness of northwestern Ontario, Jacob had learned early on that the best way to ring in the new year was with a fishing rod in hand and the quiet stillness of a frozen lake underfoot. It was a tradition passed down from his father, a burly man who preferred the company of the wilderness to the clamor of society. Every New Year's Eve, Jacob, his brother, and their father's friends would trek to a secluded lake, drill holes in the ice, and fish under the stars, their laughter echoing across the frozen expanse. It was a ritual that grounded Jacob, a reminder of simpler times. But life had a way of changing things. Jacob's father passed away, his brother moved to Chicago, and the group that once filled the lake with camaraderie dwindled. Still, Jacob felt a deep obligation to keep the tradition alive. At 27, he was a rugged figure himself, with a lumberjack's build and a quiet intensity that matched the wilderness he called home. His best friends, Nate and Trevor, shared his love for the outdoors, their burly frames and easy camaraderie making them the perfect companions for the annual pilgrimage. Together, the three of them set out to honor the past, determined to make New Year's Eve a night of connection and quiet triumph. That year, Nate was behind the wheel of his hulking pickup truck, its four-wheel drive cutting through the snow-covered back roads with ease. The truck bed was loaded with gear, rods, tip-ups, bait, a sled to haul it all, and a pop-up shelter to shield them from the biting cold. The forecast promised a clear night, but in Ontario, the weather was as unpredictable as the wind. Jacob, Nate, and Trevor were prepared for anything, their years in the wilderness teaching them to expect the unexpected. As they drove, the mood was light, the cab filled with stories of past fishing trips and the promise of a good catch. Their destination was a lake few knew about, a hidden gem tucked away in a dense forest, its surface frozen solid even in the milder winters. It was a place of solitude, far from the well-trodden paths of casual anglers. As Nate navigated the final stretch of snowy road, Jacob felt a familiar thrill, the anticipation of the night ahead. But as they pulled up to the trailhead, something caught his eye. A figure standing a few yards away, bundled in heavy winter gear. The man was motionless, his gaze fixed on the truck, his presence an anomaly in the desolate landscape. Jacob's instincts prickled. The lake was too remote for casual visitors, and the man's stillness felt unnatural. He watched as the stranger glanced at his phone, then back at the truck, then at his phone again. The movements were deliberate, almost calculated, and they set Jacob's nerves on edge. "That guy's creeping me out," he muttered to his friends. Trevor shrugged, dismissing it as nothing, but Nate's nod was more guarded, his eyes narrowing as he studied the stranger. They began to unload their gear, the cold biting at their fingers, when the man suddenly rushed toward them, his arms flailing. Jacob rolled down the window, bracing himself. The man was frantic, his voice high and desperate as he shouted that his friend had fallen through the ice. He held up his phone, claiming another companion had just called him with the news. The urgency in his voice was undeniable, his panic infectious. Before Jacob could process it, Trevor was out of the truck, his instincts kicking in. Nate and Jacob followed, their hearts pounding as they sprinted after the man down the trail toward the lake. They didn't stop to grab coats or gear, the man's desperation overriding any hesitation. The trail was narrow, the snow deep, and the man moved with a speed that belied his heavy gear. As they neared the lake, Jacob's unease grew. The man wasn't leading them to the usual fishing spots where the ice was thick and reliable. Instead, he was veering toward a remote section of the shoreline, a place where the ice was thinner, the terrain unfamiliar. Jacob opened his mouth to protest, but it was too late. Two more figures emerged from the shadows, standing at the lake's edge. They weren't dressed for fishing, no rods, no gear, just dark clothing and an eerie stillness. Jacob's blood ran cold as he saw the glint of metal in their hands, guns pointed directly at them. The man they'd been following turned, a smirk curling his lips. It was a trap, and they'd walked right into it. "Stop right there," one of the armed men barked, his voice cutting through the silence. The gun was trained on Jacob, its barrel a dark promise of violence. Jacob's heart pounded, a primal fear gripping him as he raised his hands. The man who'd led them there stood smugly, his desperation revealed as a cruel facade. The second armed man demanded Nate's keys and everything they had, wallets, phones, anything of value. Jacob's mind raced, his anger warring with his fear. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and miles from help. Nate tossed the truck keys to the ground, his jaw clenched. Jacob and Trevor emptied their pockets, Jacob trying to palm his phone, but one of the men caught him. "Phones too," he growled. Nate lied, saying his was in the truck, a quick thinking that would later prove crucial. The men laughed, their confidence chilling. Jacob's fists clenched, his body aching to fight, but the guns kept him rooted in place. He'd never felt so powerless, so betrayed by his own trust. The men marched them back to the trailhead at gunpoint, their movements swift and practiced. One of them climbed into Nate's truck, the engine roaring to life as he sped off into the night. The other two backed into the woods, vanishing into the shadows, likely to their own vehicle. Jacob considered giving chase, but the risk was too great. They were alone, stranded, with nothing but the clothes on their backs in the biting cold. For a moment they stood in stunned silence, the reality of what had happened sinking in. Then Nate pulled out his phone, the one he'd lied about, and Jacob felt a surge of hope. They had service, barely, and Nate called the police, his voice steady despite the rage burning in his eyes. The dispatcher told them to stay put, promising help was on the way. They huddled together, their breath clouding in the frigid air, their anger and fear mingling in the silence. Nate was inconsolable, his fury erupting as he kicked at the snow and cursed the men who'd taken everything. Jacob and Trevor tried to calm him, but their own anger simmered beneath the surface. The wait for the police felt endless, the cold seeping into their bones. When help finally arrived, the officers took their statements, their expressions grim. They drove the trio to Trevor's house, the closest refuge, and promised to search for the truck and the men. But in their hearts, Jacob, Nate, and Trevor knew the truth. The truck was gone, and the men would likely never be found. The incident left scars, both literal and figurative. Nate's truck was never recovered, a loss that hit him hard. The three friends still fish, but they avoid that lake, its once peaceful shores tainted by betrayal. Trevor believes it was a crime of opportunity, a random encounter with the wrong people. Jacob isn't so sure. The man's phone, the calculated glances, the precision of the ambush, it felt planned, deliberate. But why target them in the middle of nowhere on New Year's Eve? The question haunts Jacob, a puzzle with no solution, a reminder that even the wilderness, with all its beauty, hides dangers that no amount of preparation can predict.